Alright, so in this video we're going to look at a couple different examples of using JavaScript to manipulate the DOM and just to add interactivity to a website. So I have a series of examples here. There's a total of 6, and we're just going to work through them and talk about the syntax. Okay, so this first example, the goal is to remove an entire div and its content from a web page. So that's what this first button does. If we click here, you can see that whole first div disappears. Let's reload the page there, and it comes back. Okay, so this is the general structure. Actually, let's go ahead and go down to the actual implementation here in the code also. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm setting the div to a variable so it can be called, and I'm doing that using this get element by ID method that's associated with the document object. So effectively, I'm grabbing the element that has this opening div ID associated with it. And then I'm also doing the same thing for this first button, which has this button1 ID associated with it. So now I basically have the div that I want to manipulate and the button I'm going to use associated with the variable. Now the next step is to add an event listener, and I'm adding this event listener to the button. So we have our button variable, button1, and then the event listener method. And then here we're specifying what the event is. So in this case, the event is a click. And then we have this anonymous function, which then does something on the event or the click. So basically what we're saying here is if div1 do this. So if div1 is basically saying if the div exists. So this is basically the same as saying div1 exists, and if that returns true, then it will do this. If not, then nothing will happen. So basically we're saying div1 and then the parent mode dot remove child. So effectively what we're saying is remove this div1 object from its parent node, which I believe is the body. Let's go up and check actually to make sure. Yeah, so this is div1 and it's within the body. So basically we're removing div1 from the body object. Okay, so again, when I click this button, then this div does exist, so evaluates the true, and then this code gets executed. Okay, so that's an example of removing a div there with this event listener. Okay, so our next example is toggling between two images. All right, so I've generalized this a bit. In the example, I didn't put the URL or the paths there. But as you can see here, the setup is effectively the same as the prior example. So we're setting our image object to a variable, and we're getting it using its ID. So this get element by ID method on the document object, and then we're calling the image1 object there, or ID, and then same thing for the button. So we have our two elements that we need to interact with. Just like in the first example, I'm adding an event listener to the button. The event is a click, and then this is the function. So basically this is saying if this is the path to, if this is the current source of the image, so this is the source property for the image object there, then it's going to change the source to this other image. And then if it's not this, which means it's the other image in this case, then it's going to change it to that first image. So this should be a toggle where you're going to have two options. You have if the if condition evaluates to true, do this, and if not, you have a default, right? So if we click this, let me click there. You see that's the image. So as we click it, we're switching between the two images, right? Cool. Okay, so that's we have some control flow in here to decide which image to load based on what image is already loaded. Again, this is probably the key difference here between the first example is we're using this dot source, which is allowing us to access the source property of this image variable, which is the URL there to the image. Just as a quick note, let's open up the developer tools real quick and just see how we can actually access these elements using the same method here. So I'm going to switch to the console, and we'll do a split here. So I'm just going to call this, we actually may need to reload this real quick. Okay, I'm going to load this image real quick just to make a point. So save our image there to a variable. And then let's see what's actually stored here in its source property. probably going to need to clear that again. There we go. All right, there you go. So that's the path, right? So anyway, you're basically just accessing this property in the code, same as we're doing here in the console. Okay, that's the next example. So now let's move on to our third example. So the third example here is changing the body background color, so the entire background color for the body. Okay, so same setup. Now we're not going to set the body to a variable. Instead, we're just grabbing the third button there and setting it to a variable. Same thing, we're setting up an event listener. The event is a click, and then this is the function that gets executed. So it's going to take the document.body.style.background. So here we're basically accessing the body object inside of the document object. And then for the body, we're looking at its style properties. And then within its style properties, we have its background color, and we're just setting it. Just as, again, a side note, just let me pull up here the developer tools. So if we want, we can see what the current background color is set to. Oops, it says it is empty. That's probably because it's grabbing it from the class there, the class that it's associated with. But this would be basically overriding it. All right, cool. So let's run that. So again, if we click this button, changes the background color. If we click it again, it's always just setting it to this. So it's not actually changing anything. So it's not a toggle like the last one. It's just basically just does it once. Just out of curiosity, let me look again at the developer tools. If we do call this, we should have either the hex code there or the collar assigned. So we run that. Okay, so now we do have it assigned, but this is kind of interesting. So see, instead of saving the hex code, it actually saved the RGB values. So that's something you got to be a little bit careful with. So if I had done like an if statement here where I was checking to see if it was the hex code, it wouldn't really have worked because it's actually saving it there as the RGB values. And if you're not sure, you can always search for that specific property using using the console. Okay, that's a third example. So fourth example here is toggling between two style sheets. So before we do this, just have a look at the structure of the website. So I have the index file here, and then I've got a couple different style sheets. And if we go up here to the top of the code in the head, we have a link tag where we're linking to the My Styles. So that's what's going to load by default. So let's see now what this event listener is doing. So cool. So click button. All right. So basically, it's looking to see if the style sheet is currently this. Then it's going to change it to the other style sheet, in which case named My Styles Alt. And if it's anything else, then it'll just be My Style Sheet. So in this case, the if statement should be true, so we should get back the changed style sheet to the My Styles Alt style sheet. And note how we're accessing this is using this My Sheet ID, which has been assigned to the link, has been assigned to this link tag here. So you can also assign IDs and whatnot to objects within the head, not just in the body. Cool. And then the other thing was the same thing. We set that we save the button there to a variable. All right. So if we click this, that switches style sheet. Actually, as a quick side note, that didn't actually work, and let's see why it didn't work. So it didn't actually grab the correct one. So let's open the developer tools and see why that didn't work. And I kind of knew this wasn't, or I had a suspicion that this wasn't going to work. So let's see. Well, actually, let's reload the page here. And so it's back to where it started. And I'm going to create this variable. And then we're going to see what its href is. Okay, so you can see there, that's why it didn't work. So I have this set up in VS Code, and it's using this kind of like mock server setup, which actually kind of changes the path to the file. So if I wanted this to actually work the way that I expected it to, I would need to, I would need to swap this out down here. So get rid of get rid of this. Oops, that did not work. Hang on a second. To grab this. Oh, I guess I can just grab it up here. And we'll do the same thing down here also. So again, this isn't really like a mistake necessarily. This just has to do with how this mock server setup here in VS Code works. What you should generally do with this is, so let me get this fixed up here, you would have relative paths relative to your directory, unless you're referencing something that's actually stored at like a different URL. All right, let's see if that works. Okay, so let's see if that works now. Did not. Let me see what's going on. So my alt, my styles. Try this one more time. I think it might be because I had too many. Let's see if that works. There we go. That worked that time. And then we can bounce between the two style sheets. So again, that was not really a mistake. It had to do with how this server, mock server setup works and how it was reading the path there. Again, if you use relative path relative to your directory when you have that actually set up on a website, on a server, it should work fine. Okay, adding a paragraph. Okay, so this is that example. So we're again setting this, so we're over to the 5th button to add a paragraph. So we're setting that to a variable. Then we are setting this content div to a variable. So we're basically doing the final, or linking to the final div, which is this last div on the page, which currently just has this header and then that list in it. Okay, and then once the button is clicked, we create a new paragraph. So we do document.create element, and we create a p element, and then that new element gets assigned some text, and we're using the text content property there. And then lastly, we are using content div.append child, which is going to append this new paragraph into the div with this final div ID applied to it. So every time we click this, you can see it's adding a new paragraph text down there. Okay, and then lastly, we have an example where we're updating a span. So we're changing the text color of a span. This span is here in the second div there. So same basic setup. We're grabbing the span using the get element by ID method on the document object, and then we're using that span's ID. And then we're setting our button there to a variable, and then setting an event listener on a click event, and it executes a function where it changes the span's color to this color. So if we click this, you see down here that this color got updated. And we should be able to see that new color assignment. Again, if we would do span1 dot style dot color, and there we go. But you can see here it saved it as an RGB value as opposed to the hex code. Okay, so those are some basic examples. If you want to learn more JavaScript specifically for DOM manipulation, highly recommend checking out the W3 Schools page on the topic. There's a lot you can do, and unfortunately a lot of it's fairly similar, and if you understand the basics, that can actually go a pretty long way.